Continuing on with Chapter 35, we're looking at America's involvement in World War II. Now, like I referenced before, the United States is facing a two-front war, meaning we're basically fighting two wars at the exact same time. One focused on the Japanese over in the Pacific, and one focused on the Germans and the Italians over in Europe. So let's first take a look at the Pacific theater of war. Now, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they also attacked other key locations in the Pacific to create that Pacific empire that their focus is on, attacking Guam, Wake Islands, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Malaya, etc. Their focus here is not only to attack the U.S. and knock us out of the ballgame before we even get involved, but to also acquire rubber, tin, oil, etc. These are all things necessary for their war effort. Now, the Chinese are also our allies over in the Pacific because they had long been facing attacks by the Japanese. And so in order to supply our Chinese allies, we'd been using the Burma Road, as it was called, to send supplies to the Chinese nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek, who we'll talk about again later on, in order to fight the Japanese. The problem comes in when the Japanese attacked and cut off these supply lines, and now the U.S. had to send supplies to the Chinese over the Himalayan mountains, which is obviously going to be much, much more difficult. Now, in the Pacific, the U.S. Army was headed up by General Douglas MacArthur. He's going to be important for a little while longer. He was surprised, and his army was basically forced to retreat first to Bataan and then to Corregidor. And finally, they had to escape from the island because they just were unprepared for the attack of the Japanese on the Philippine Islands. He ordered a retreat to Australia in early 42, where he famously said, "I shall return," because he left behind a 75,000-man army, both Americans and Filipino. This army, who was unsuccessful at evacuating, was forced to surrender and were taken as prisoners of war by the Japanese. This is going to be a very low point for these soldiers. Here you see the Bataan Death March, which we're about to reference here in a second. Here are some American sailors dead in New Guinea. Now, like I said, these American and Filipino forces were forced to surrender and then were taken on a forced death march, as it was called, 80 miles to their prisoner of war camp. They were denied food, they were denied water, and if they fell down, they were beaten and left on the side of the road to die. The Japanese are actually going to be put on trials for war crimes, in part because of the Bataan Death March. Now that the Japanese, though, were successful at acquiring all of these territories in the Pacific, their new focus is moving towards New Guinea. It's focused on moving towards Australia and taking control of that for their Pacific empire. But in May of 1942, in an all-naval battle using aircraft carriers, Americans in combination with the Australians were able to halt the Japanese movement towards Australia at the Battle of Coral Sea. We're going to start now pushing the Japanese back by this point. In June of 1942, the turning point, as it's considered in the Pacific theater of war, is the Battle of Midway. Once again, the Japanese were attempting to achieve a very strategic island known as Midway. It's very, very tiny, but it's strategic for several reasons. Number one, it's literally the midway point between the Pacific, Hawaii, and the United States. It's also a good point where they could launch an invasion on the Alaskan Islands, the Aleutian Islands to the north. So it is in our best interest to ensure that the Japanese do not acquire the island of Midway, which we successfully were able to push them back, led by Admiral Chester Nimitz and Raymond Spruance at the Battle of Midway. This is, like I said, the turning point in the Pacific theater of war, where the United States and Australians and Chinese are going to begin pushing them back into Japan. Here you see some of the American prisoners of war on the Bataan Death March. And obviously a propaganda poster alluding to that Bataan Death March to keep people working. Now, one thing that you must know about the Pacific theater of war, that the American strategy in the Pacific is known as island hopping. This is crazy, crazy important. We had very limited resources, and there's a whole lot of islands in the Pacific that we have to recapture. So instead of capturing every single tiny island that the Japanese had dug into, we were going to pick strategically located islands, focus on capturing them, then skipping over or hopping over the less important ones to acquire the next one. But those ones in the middle would then, quote, wither on the vine because we are cutting off their supply lines. All of this, the goal is to get us closer to Japan in order to eventually launch bombing raids on Japan proper. So some of the more important battles in this island hopping campaign. In August of 42, in an amphibious landing at Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal is one island in the Solomon Islands. Nobody had heard of Guadalcanal prior to this, but this was considered an important or strategic location because it was necessary to maintain the shipping lanes into Australia. It's going to take a whole lot of effort to push the Japanese out. They're going to fight almost to the last man on each of these islands because of their need to ensure their pride. 20,000 Japanese died at the Battle of Guadalcanal, or the campaign for Guadalcanal, compared to only 1,700 Americans. But by this point now, the Americans and Australians have been successful. They're at the southern tip of New Guinea. At this point, MacArthur is now named Supreme Allied Commander of all forces in the Pacific, and their goal is to get them as far away from Australia and also to start returning to the Philippines. So with those end goals in mind, the U.S. forces launch attacks on the Marianas Islands, which put us within bombing distance to Japan, and also the Battle of the Philippine Sea. This is an important battle because the U.S. destroyed too many Japanese carriers for them to ever be able to recover. So by June of 44, the Japanese are pretty much done. They're just going to hold on for a whole nother year. And here you see where some of these strategic locations are in the island hopping campaign. So we'll come back to Japan in a minute. Let's take a look at what's going on over in Europe concurrently. Before the United States actually even got into World War II, we were already somewhat engaged in the Battle of the Atlantic as we were convoying those merchant ships over to Europe for Lend-Lease, facing off against the German submarines. And in 1942, 500 merchant ships were sunk alone. It is necessary to be able to get our supplies to Europe, or else there is no way we're going to win this war. So the Battle of the Atlantic is extremely important. Several ways we were able to achieve success. Number one, aside from just convoying them with naval ships surrounding that merchant ship, they would now be convoyed with air support as well. Also using radar in order to find those U-boats. And now that the British had also broken that Enigma code, this was the German secret code, we were able to locate those U-boats much more effectively. This is starting to turn the tide in favor of the Allies, but there's still a long way to go. In northern Africa, the German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, he's known as the Desert Fox, his goal for the German army was to capture the Suez Canal, to take Egypt and take the Suez Canal. This is a strategic location. Number one, it would link the European theater to the Pacific theater. They could have access sea-wise to their allies over in Japan. They could have access to the Middle East. So it is very important from an Allied perspective that they do not acquire the Suez Canal. So facing off in 1942 against the British General Bernard Montgomery, also in these battles were American General Dwight D. Eisenhower and George S. Patton. The Allies, I should say, achieved success at the Battle of El Alamein, starting to push Rommel back. Eventually pushing them all the way back to Tunisia. The Allies were able to cut the German supply lines and effectively secured control over the Suez Canal, which is obviously important. Concurrently, though, at this time, the Nazis begin moving their attention towards Stalingrad in the Soviet Union. So remember, last chapter we talked about the Operation Barbarossa, focusing on the Soviet Union. By the winter of 42, they realized, well, this isn't going to work. We need oil. Just beyond Stalingrad are major oil fields. Stalin says, no matter what, Stalingrad must hold. We can't allow the Nazis to have access to this oil. And so, in a battle that launched massive, massive casualties. The end of the World War II, the Russians lost, it's estimated, 10 million people. Stalingrad did hold, but once again, this was some of the most brutal fighting of the war. The Soviet Union needs a break. Here you see where the Battle of El Alamein is and how close it came to the Suez Canal. So, like I said, the Soviet Union is desperate for anything. They need some relief. They had already started pushing the Germans back, but they are just being bombarded with massive casualties. Stalin is begging his allies for a second front. Basically, he wanted the Americans and the British to launch an invasion into France to retake German-occupied France in order to alleviate the pressure off of him over in the Soviet Union, to divert some of the Germans' attention away from the Soviet Union and over to France. The problem is, though, according to Churchill and FDR, they weren't ready in 1942-1943 for an invasion into France. France was far too fortified by the German army for them to achieve success. They needed a little bit more time. So Churchill said, let us focus on what he called the soft underbelly of the Axis powers. Let's attack through Sicily, through Italy, where they are far weaker. If you think of an animal, if you try to, and this is a really gross analogy, if you try to stab an animal in the shoulder blade, it's going to be difficult to kill them because of how fortified that shoulder blade is. But stabbing them in the stomach where they're weaker is a much more effective strategy. They said the Italian army is nowhere near as strong as the German army, so let us focus on Italy. This was determined with Operation Torch, the invasion into northern Africa, headed up by, like I said, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Success there then later spawns the Casablanca Conference in January of 43, where not only did they say, let us invade through Italy and Sicily, but FDR, Churchill, and Charles de Gaulle, who is the Free French Army commander, advocated for the unconditional surrender of the Axis. This basically means we're only going to accept the Axis powers surrendering to us. There can be no conditions. They can't say, we'll surrender if we can have X, Y, and Z. No, they don't get that option. And so they determine their battle plan into Italy and Sicily and launch an invasion. And Churchill had been right. The Italians were not willing to put up with these shenanigans. They were not willing to put up with warfare among them. And so very, very quickly after the invasion into Italy and Sicily, Mussolini was deposed, and it looked like the Italians were going to surrender. Well, they did surrender. The problem comes in that Hitler is not going to let Italy go so fast. And so the German army invades Italy, and some of the worst fighting that we ever encountered actually was on the Italian peninsula. Because we weren't facing the Italians, we were facing the Germans. Battles such as Monte Cassino and Anzio in order to reach Rome, which we didn't acquire until June of 44. So finally, by 1944, the Allied powers realize, okay, we have enough stuff. At the Teheran Conference, which is in Iran, they say it is time for us to invade France. This secret plan to invade through France is known as Operation Overlord. So as the Americans, the Canadians, and the British would invade and land at the beaches of Normandy, France, to start pushing the Germans out, the Soviet Union would start invading from the east. Day one of Operation Overlord, the first day of the landing of the beaches on Normandy, France, is known as D-Day. This is June 6, 1944. You absolutely have to know that date. With an amphibious landing on the beaches, 4,600 vessels, absolutely no cover protecting the soldiers as they come on shore. Also, simultaneously, airborne divisions dropping behind enemy lines, trying to push the Germans back. A lot of casualties in D-Day and the coming days after D-Day. But slowly but surely, the American, British, and Canadian forces were successful in pushing the Germans back. By August of 44, Paris was liberated, and now France rejoins this war effort after having Nazi occupation for so many years. Here you see the beaches of the Normandy invasion. Here you see a very famous photograph of the men waiting on sea or on shore at the Normandy invasion. And this is D-Day plus 3 weeks, I want to say. All of the supplies coming into Europe to start pushing the Germans back. And obviously, French people are excited to be liberated from the Germans. Now, the end of the war is only a matter of time away. Starting in 1944, the Americans, French, and British start launching bombing raids onto Germany, both saturation bombing, just trying to decimate whatever they can to basically weaken the morale of the German people, and also strategic bombing, focusing on factories, focusing on railroad lines, to hurt them where it is most important, and also get the groundwork ready for the coming invasion. But the Germans still have one major offensive in there. This is known as the Battle of the Bulge. As the American, French, and British troops are marching across the face of Europe, the Germans try to break through this Allied line. Their goal was to break the line, capture the port city of Antwerp in the Netherlands, and then encircle our forces and force us to surrender. That was their goal. However, instead of actually breaking through the line, the 101st Airborne was able to retain the strategic location of Bastogne until reinforcements could arrive. And so instead of breaking the line, they literally just created a bulge in the line. Reinforcements arrived, that bulge was pushed back out, and the Allies continued moving across Europe into Germany itself. By March of 44, the U.S. troops were at the Rhine River and very quickly meet the Russians just near Berlin. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler committed suicide, and without their leader, Germany has no choice but to surrender, which they do on May 7th, 1945. The next day is called VE Day, Victory in Europe, when the Germans are officially out of this war. Here you see the troop movement across the face of Europe, pushing the genie back into the bottle. Here is that Battle of the Bulge. They'd attempted to break the line. Instead, they just pushed a bulge into it. And here are the Americans at the Battle of Bastogne. Now, back to the Pacific. All of this is happening concurrently, like I said. The Japanese, once again, were pushed out of New Guinea. MacArthur is very focused on reacquiring the Philippines. He had promised to return. He'd said, "I shall return." So he wants to come and save his men, I guess, in the Philippines. This is only going to happen because of the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1945. The American Navy decimated the Japanese Navy. They are near the end. They are just refusing to give in. This is considered the largest naval battle in modern history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. MacArthur then moves on Manila, which is on the island of Luzon. Manila is the capital of the Philippines, which he is able to liberate in July of 45. He very famously says, "I have returned, flock to me." But still, major battles still to be faced. The battles of Iwo Jima and the Battle of Okinawa. At Iwo Jima, once again, the Japanese were so dug in, holes and tunnels throughout the entire island, and they were willing to fight almost to the last man. 20,000 Japanese died alone at the Battle of Iwo Jima. This is also where that very famous photograph was taken of the men raising the flag at the top of Mount Suribachi. The Battle of Okinawa, once again, this puts us within bombing range of Japan. We are preparing for an invasion of mainland Japan, estimates of which ranged as high as 1 million casualties to invade Japan proper. Here you see our focus of reacquiring the Pacific, and that very famous picture, the raising the flag at Mount Suribachi. So, the invasion of Japan was set to commence in November of 1945. Now that Hitler is knocked out of this, the other allies are going to get involved. And at the Potsdam Conference, which was held in July of 45 in the occupied territory of Germany, the Allied powers, Stalin, Winston Churchill, who was replaced halfway through the conference by Clement Attlee, and the new president of Harry Truman, since FDR had died in April, they refocused their attention on calling for the unconditional surrender of Japan. They're not going to put up with any sort of conditions. They also started talking about rebuilding Europe, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. It's also during the Potsdam Conference that Truman finds out that the Manhattan Project is complete. This is a secret project where the U.S. government spent $2 billion to build an atomic bomb. Originally, the bomb had been planned to be dropped on Germany, but the war had ended. So now here is Truman. He's faced with this several questions. Number one, there are casualty rates as high as 1 million people if we invade Japan. Is it worth it? Number two, the Soviet Union is going to get involved in the Pacific theater. Do we want to monkey around for very long and allow the Soviet Union to start acquiring territory? Even though they were our ally during World War II, that was just more out of convenience than anything. The Cold War is looming in the very near future. We want to end this war so that the Soviets can't acquire anything else. And number two or three, he just wants this war over with. And so he makes a decision that so on August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. 180,000 dead, wounded, or dying. And then lots and lots more to die in the coming years from radiation poisoning. This is ushering in that atomic age, which we obviously still experience today. They still refused to surrender, and so on August 9th, 1945, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. By this point, the peace was agreed to, and the unconditional surrender was declared. VJ Day, victory over Japan, when MacArthur accepted their terms of surrender. The problem with this is, and many people still argue about this today, whether or not Truman should have been tried for war crimes because of the dropping of these two bombs. The majority of these were civilians. These were not military targets. But I guess to the victor go the spoils of war. Here you see that very classic mushroom cloud of the atomic bomb. This is Hiroshima after its complete devastation, totally wiped out. Here's another picture depicting Hiroshima after the atomic bomb. And last but not least, somebody who had been burned very severely from the atomic bomb blast. Obviously, this person died later on. And that is it for Chapter 35.